Dynamite.
All right.
Okay. The next best thing to having Clara of Assisi with us is Eileen Parfrey, who is on deck to talk to us about Clara and her friend Francis, clear up any controversy, give us some idea about this young man who took off all his clothes in the town square in Assisi some years ago, 800 or so, right?
800.
Yeah.
800.
So I'll just get out of the way and let you address the crowd.
Okay. Okay. I thought you were going to do a disclaimer about nepotism in terms of having your wife speaking, but never mind. So, I have been associated with the Franciscan Spiritual Center since 2015 in an employed position. Prior to that, I did quite a bit of volunteering at something called the Hermitage Experience for about 5 years. And prior to that, one of the very first phone calls I made in 2000 when I moved to Oregon was to a spiritual director. I felt that a pastor should not be doing any pastoring without a spiritual director. And so as I was leaving Madison, Wisconsin, I said to my director, who do you know in Portland, Oregon that you could put me towards? Because this was in the olden days before Zoom. So we knew that I couldn't continue with my spiritual director. And so I called the Franciscan Renewal Center. It was the Renewal Center at the time. And this person answered the phone saying, "This is Sister Mary Jo." And my heart just plummeted. I thought, this is my spiritual director. And I was right. I was right. So that was kind of fun. She spent she spent probably 4 years nagging me about taking spiritual direction training before I finally took it because it was just sheer desperation to get her to stop nagging me. So I did, and served as continued to serve as pastor at Springwater Presbyterian Church until I retired in 2015 and began working at the Franciscan Spiritual Center. So I know a few stories about Francis and Claire. One of the things that struck me immediately as I began learning about St. Francis, I'd never had a Franciscan spiritual director at the time until I met Sister Mary Jo. And I hadn't really known that much about Francis. But as soon as I started learning about him, I thought, oh my gosh, this is a guy that makes following the gospel accessible. Like I could understand Francis's life. I couldn't, Jesus was just way out there. He was just way too holy. I could never be like him. But Francis seemed to be like an ordinary guy, someone that I could try to like see what he did and see what my life would look like if I was kind of imitating Francis, because Francis's whole life was absolutely devoted to following the gospel, just walking in the footsteps of Jesus. So I thought, well, I'll just fall in line behind Francis and that'll work pretty well. So that's kind of a roundabout way of saying this is my definition of what a mystic is. It's someone who sees the world the way it really is. And that would be Francis. Francis, Francis was the kind of man that simplified things. He was barely literate, and in 800 years ago, to be barely literate meant that you probably could write your name and you could read a few words, but not a whole lot. And that was okay because there weren't a lot of books in the first place. So Scott alluded to Francis taking his clothes off in the public square in Assisi. Um, but I'd like to back up and give you the backstory to that. Um, Francis was probably the only son, he's the only son we've heard of an up and coming merchant. So he was more than middle class, but he was not nobility in the town of Assisi. Francis, his family was nouveau riche, as opposed to Claire's family, which was actually nobility. So Francis came out of nouveau riche territory, and his father had been grooming him since birth to take over the family business, which was being a cloth merchant. Francis was the kind of teenager, hadn't really invented teenagers yet, but he was the kind of young person who was dedicated to fun. All of the kids in town wanted to hang out with Francis. And when I say all the kids in town, that means all the boys, because the girls were not allowed out and girls weren't allowed to do anything in a public realm. So Francis and his friends sort of roved the town doing fun things. And he was kind of a ringleader for that kind of stuff. He was also kind of a funny looking kid. He was never a very big man. He's shorter than me, and so he was probably 5 feet at tops. He had big ears that really did stick out, and at least from the painting that came to us from that time. And he was bald as a man. He also probably had leprosy. And so it wasn't that he was disfigured per se, but he became blind as he got older. So he was kind of a mixed bag, and still he was so engaging and people just loved to be around him. So that kind of made up for it. So there were several conversion experiences that Francis had. The first one seems to have been that that he was taken as a prisoner of war. The city states in Italy were constantly at war with each other. And so Perugia and Assisi went to war. And one way for the middle class to climb out of middle class and into nobility was to have your kid knighted. So that was, Francis went off to war hoping to become a knight. His father spent a great deal of money on buying a lovely suit of armor for Francis. He went off. Within about 15 minutes of getting to Perugia, he was captured and spent at least a year in jail. And we don't know if that was because his father was reluctant to pay the ransom money or what it was, but his father really apparently didn't really want him out very quickly. So Francis got out of jail, came back home, and he was a changed man. So then he was more kind of at loose ends and he wandered the countryside. And one day he was in a little broken down chapel. And I don't know why this was, that there was a beautiful crucifix that we now refer to as the San Damiano cross. There's this beautiful crucifix hanging in the chapel. And the chapel was mostly broken down. And as Francis was talking to God somehow, sort of complaining about how his life seemed to be at loose ends, he heard the figure on the crucifix. He heard the Christ saying, Francis, rebuild my church because you can see it's fallen into ruin. Okay, so that's one of the conversion experiences that Francis had, that he heard a crucifix talking to him. Another conversion experience that happened to Francis is that Scott's holding up the San Damiano cross. So that's the figure of the Christ on the cross, and the head is up on the Christ, and so it represents it represents the resurrected Christ because the head is up, and so of course the resurrected Christ could talk to Francis. Of course, yeah.
Thank you.
It's a beautiful, I've seen it in person. It's a beautiful, beautiful cross. And it's probably 5 feet tall. It's just stunning. I'll tell you more about that in a little bit. Assisi is on a hill, and then down in the valley, there's this sort of swampy area, which was even more swampy when Francis was alive. And that's where all the lepers lived. So living conditions were squalid at best for most people in Assisi at that time. And for lepers, they were really dreadful. They're living in a swamp. If you are a leper, you can never go near anybody. You always have to be making noise, a clangor or something. so that people wouldn't come near you because they weren't sure what you got, how you got leprosy, but they think it might have been associated with touching. And so you just didn't want to be close. So Francis came across this man and got down off his horse um, and kissed him because he was perceiving this person as the Christ. And so that was another one of his conversion experiences. And because he's having these little conversions, Francis starts taking the cloth out of his father's shop and giving it to poor people. His father had really beautiful, lovely, expensive cloth, and to give that cloth away was just a heinous activity. And at first, Francis's father locked him in the cellar and to punish him for doing that, the medieval equivalent of being grounded. But his mother, maybe he was kind of a mama's boy in some ways, but his mother let him out of the prison. And so Francis kept on giving away the cloth. And finally, Francis's father, in sheer desperation and anger, dragged Francis by the ear over to the Cathedral San Rufino, named after the patron saint of Assisi. He brought Francis over there and he said to the bishop, "Look at this kid. He's just ruining my business. He's stealing from me, and he's just going on a rant." And everybody in town, of course, is hearing about this. So they're all running to San Rufino to see what's going on. And Francis finally says, "Okay, Dad, I only have one father, and that's my father in heaven." And Francis's father says, "But I gave you everything you have. I've got clothes on your back," and he's carrying on. And so Francis just strips
Oh,
and walks out of the church. And the bishop doesn't think this is appropriate exactly. And so he runs after Francis and puts a tunic on him, puts a brown robe on him, and Francis gets a rope as a belt and a pair of sandals, and that's what he wears the rest of his life. Not that particular robe, because Francis had a habit of giving his clothes away. Well, because if someone didn't have any clothes, then Francis, of course, gave him the clothes. I need to back up and say that prior to that, Francis had met with the bishop one day and said, "I think I'm hearing a call to follow Jesus, and I don't know what that is." And so the two of them opened scripture to three passages, and Francis put his finger down and sounded out the words, and figured out that one of the passages said, "Take nothing for yourselves, but go out and preach the gospel, and don't bring a purse, and only have one tunic, and don't take any provisions." So Francis took it at that, took it literally, and that's what he did the rest of his life. So Francis really never set out to start a new order. I'm going to sneeze.
that's okay.
Excuse me. He never set out to start a new order because, in fact, he'd been given this job by the Christ on the crucifix to rebuild the church. And so what Francis did was he went around town either begging for rocks or begging for the money to buy rocks to repair that chapel. And so he got the chapel done, and then a couple other friends joined him, and they started repairing all of the other little churches in the area, begging for rocks. What a ridiculous thing. And begging for enough food to eat for that day. And that's how they were living. And pretty soon it went from 3 people to, well, within years, it was several hundred thousand, not 100,000, several hundred to 1,000, was just in a few short years. So Francis is going around begging, rebuilding, and preaching. And along the way, he discovers that he has a ministry with lepers. And so he spends a lot of time with the lepers, which is probably where he got leprosy. Meanwhile, remember I said that Francis was in the church San Rufino. The house right next to San Rufino, it shares a wall. That house is where Claire grew up. And because the public square was right there, it's likely that Claire started hearing Francis preaching outside her very window. And so Claire, as I mentioned, was from the nobility. Um, she was a tall woman. She was beautiful. She appears to have had reddish brown hair, very long, very beautiful. She was to her family a very valuable commodity because wealthy people would marry their children to each other's children and that way build up their own estates. And so Claire had a lovely dowry that was coming to her, and she had several suitors, and I think her uncle appears to have been the patriarch of the family. Her uncle was negotiating with whoever would be the best suitor for Claire. So it comes up to Palm Sunday, and the tradition in the town was that on Palm Sunday, the bishop would take olive branches and walk down the center aisle and hand an olive branch to a young marriageable girl. Claire took an olive branch, and everyone knew that Claire was saying yes, she would accept a suitor. Except that isn't what Claire meant. She meant that she wanted to be a bride of Christ. So Claire had apparently been in contact with Francis and had worked out that she could join up with Francis and his friends because the evening of Palm Sunday, which was nearly a full moon, as it is every single year, the evening of Palm Sunday, Claire left her family's home. She didn't leave by the front door because, of course, the front door was always locked. She left by the door that was used for taking the dead out of the house. She left through that door and went down through the city gate, which had been left open. Apparently, she bribed the gatekeeper and walked down to San Damiano, where Francis was living with his brothers. While she was there, Francis Francis and the other brothers cut Claire's hair, her beautiful long hair. They cut it right off, which meant she was totally unmarriageable.
Mm.
No one could marry her now. But Francis and the brothers knew that Claire couldn't live with them. So for a time, she went to live with the Benedictines. There was an order of women Benedictines. So meanwhile, Claire's uncle, the patriarch, knows where she is. He heads off. He's going to get Claire. He's going to take her out.
Mm.
Claire shows him her hair. He knows he can't marry her off, but he still wants to take her back so he can punish her. Claire goes over to the altar. She hangs onto the altar and he cannot get her off the altar. It's like she's become a toddler who doesn't want to be picked up. The specific gravity in her body increased significantly. And so he couldn't pull her off the altar. Skip to later in the story, Claire and the women who followed her lived in San Damiano, and Francis and his brothers moved down to the swamps by the Queen of Angels Monastery and the Queen of Angels Church and lived among the lepers. So Claire has become a trusted confidant to Francis, but because Claire is cloistered as a woman, she needed to be cloistered. She couldn't be out preaching the gospel. Just the social mores of the time would not allow her to be out preaching. So she spent her time in a cloister in poverty. Both Francis and Claire were totally devoted to poverty. Claire referred to her state as Lady Poverty, that both of them sort of personified the condition of not having any money as Lady Poverty. Claire's sisters would go out every day in town to beg, and sometimes they would get enough food and sometimes they wouldn't. living in those straitened circumstances, Claire ended up becoming ill, and she spent 26 years in bed. 26 years in bed. They lived in a room that was probably 30 by 50, sleeping on pallets on the floor, probably 100 to 150 women just sleeping in this room. I just can't imagine how terrible that would be. But for Claire, that was exactly how she wanted to live. She also had access to the San Damiano cross, which was near her bedside, so that she could spend pretty much the rest of her life meditating on that cross and praying with that cross. So, okay, those are the biographies, which I think are kind of interesting. They're definitely not the sort of stories that we would have lived through. I have some stories that I pulled out. There are hundreds of stories, and many of them are true. Not all of them are true, but there are many stories that show the brand of mysticism that both Francis and Claire have. And I forgot to say, if anybody wants clarification or has questions, please ask. Raise your electronic hand or interrupt or whatever. I would be delighted to have you interrupt. So, I said that that Francis had devoted his life to following in the footsteps of Jesus. He would say, "Live the gospel without gloss." A lot of people don't understand what that means. It means live the gospel and don't embellish it. So maybe that's why I like Francis, because he is so simple. He says, just live the gospel. Just follow what Jesus asks and don't make things fancy. So I don't know if you've heard the story of Francis receiving stigmata. Do you know stigmata? That they are, holes in your hands and feet that are essentially open wounds. The stigmata that are received by a couple of saints. Well, Francis received stigmata near the end of his life, and it isn't the church's explanation, and I think this is probably true. It isn't that he made holes in his hands and feet that never healed. It's that what had become so integrated into himself moved out through his body. Periodically, we hear about that kind of stuff, that someone is so so dedicated to something that they move out, that their body manifests what it is. This weekend, Scott's daughter was in a Taekwondo. Is it Taekwondo? Akita. What is it?
Jiu-jitsu.
Jiu-jitsu. She was in sorry, she was in a jiu-jitsu tournament, a national tournament, and she sent videos of people breaking a chopstick with a piece of tissue paper. That sounds like magic, except that it's not. They did it. We could see it. And then Margaret, Scott's daughter, used a piece of typing paper to break chopsticks. Much beefier paper, much beefier. I tried it with a piece of cardboard and it barely made a dent in the chopstick. And so Margaret said that it's a matter of centering yourself and becoming so present to the paper and the chopstick that nothing else exists. So it doesn't seem so crazy to me that Francis received stigmata, because he had so fully integrated the Christ into his life that the Christ began coming out through him. So that for Francis was living the gospel without loss. So Francis is known for a whole lot of things that are maybe a little bit sentimental or a little bit hallmarky. We always see Francis either in the bird bath or in the garden with birds covering his body or holding birds or something like that. There's a story about Francis roaming the countryside preaching, and he's preaching to people that are assembled along the side of the road, and the birds are making a big ruckus, and people are having a hard time hearing Francis because the birds are carrying on so much. So Francis turns to the birds and says, "Come on, you guys. I'm talking about Jesus. Maybe you guys want to hear about Jesus too." And the birds stop making noise. So that's why Francis is always associated with birds in the bird bath. Francis is also known as a peacemaker. What we're doing at Westminster this Lenten season is each of the preaching pastors is taking one of the lines from Francis's peace prayer. And so it's to me, it's very interesting to notice the ways that people are unpacking that kind of thing. But this is what I discovered this morning in a book that I'm reading on that. It's written by a man named Murray Bodo, who is a wonderful Franciscan scholar from the 20th and 21st century. Murray Bodo writes, "Peace is achieved more effectively by trying to bring out the best, not pointing out the worst in others. And we bring out the best in others by being ourselves peaceful. Our own peaceful presence will do more than trying to persuade others that we are right and they are wrong. Peacefulness is its own persuasion." So peace within yourself as a way of convincing others that maybe they might not be as well, they might not know as much as they thought they knew. So it's a way of making peacemaking. I did the children's sermon today, and my puppet Ralph was saying that he felt that the way he would bring peace, the way he would help bring out the best in others, is by giving them a list of ways that they could improve. Francis would never do that. Francis went from having 3 followers, from being alone to having 3 followers, to having hundreds of followers, simply by himself personifying peace. He was so present to the divine love that peace attracted others. The story is told that Francis, this was during the Crusades, and Francis was actually around during the Third Crusade. The Vatican would send out people to recruit young men to go off to the Crusades and earn their place in heaven, and drive out the infidels from Jerusalem and all those kinds of things. Well, Francis tried. The first time he tried to go to this appalled Francis. He didn't like the idea of people going off to kill other people. He thought that if he could go to talk to the Sultan, he could convert the Sultan to Christianity, and then there wouldn't be any fighting. That was Francis's plan. And so the first time he tried to go, he got sick and had to go back. The second time he tried to go, there was some problem with the transportation. It was kind of like a shipwreck, and he had to go back. The third time, he finally was able to get to the Holy Lands, and he decided that instead of marching out into the field and saying, "You, Sultan," he kind of went behind the enemy lines, and he asked to see the Sultan. He's this goofy little guy, and he's just wearing a robe, and he doesn't have any weapons. So you got to figure that the Muslims decided he was pretty harmless, and they might have thrown him in prison for a while. But the Sultan eventually hears about Francis and invites Francis to come and explain himself. So Francis and the Sultan spent about 2 weeks in conversation with each other. Yes, of course, they had translators, but they spent about 2 weeks, each trying to convert the other. And by the end of the time, each of them was so impressed with the integrity and the beauty of the other's faith that the Sultan let Francis go back, and Francis didn't feel any need to convert the Sultan anymore because they believed that they both worshipped a God that loved them and was pronounced differently in each of their own minds, but must have been the God that they both loved. So Francis left the Holy Lands and went back to Assisi, and he wrote a poem that used within it all of the names that Muslims use to address God. It's called The Praises of God, and it's got I don't know how many of the 99 names for God that Muslims use, but it's clear that Francis was profoundly influenced by what he learned from the Sultan. I love that. I love that Francis could learn from his enemy and find that his enemy was no longer his enemy. The other story about peacemaking that has learning to bring the best in others is the story of Francis and the wolf of Gubbio. The town of Gubbio was being terrorized by a wolf that was eating all of the livestock and was threatening to eat the children of the town, and everybody was staying indoors all the time because they were so afraid of the wolf and they didn't know where the wolf would strike next. So they called Francis, this peaceful little guy who seemed to have some affinity for animals. They called Francis to come over and do something about the wolf. And my puppet Ralph, of course, believes that Francis took a stick and started to whack the wolf on the head. But that's not what Francis did. Francis just sat down. And some stories say that Francis talked with the wolf and the wolf talked back. I'm not sure that spoken words were used. But there was clearly on the part of Francis, there was a clear understanding that the wolf was terrorizing these people because he was hungry. Just simply because he was hungry. Well, duh. So Francis went back to the people in the town and said, look, you guys, just feed the wolf and he will stop taking your livestock. And I can imagine the first 10 or 15 reactions that the people had to what Francis had to say. But it's a case of finding peace most effectively by bringing out the best in the other. That Francis understood that the wolf was hungry. And if he was fed, he wouldn't have to terrorize people. Now, I have an alternative reading to that story of the wolf of Gubbio. And I will tell it to you because you're all grown-ups. Yes? Raise your hand. You're all grown-ups. Okay, good. So this was told to me by a man in Italy who said that in Italian, in medieval Italian, one of the terms for prostitute sounded like the Italian word for wolf. And apparently what was going on is that there was a woman who was either seducing or getting pay from men of the area. And the wives were pretty upset about this because they thought they should have their husband's full affections, but also it was bleeding the family coffers paying this prostitute. So Francis went to talk to this prostitute, the ostensible wolf, and said, why are you doing this? She said, I have children to feed. If no one has jobs for a single woman, no one will support me. This is the only way I can make a living, and I'm feeding my children. So Francis went to the women of the town and the surrounding towns and said, support her. Give her a job or feed her children. She won't seduce your husbands if you do that. And thus solved the wolf of Gubbio problem. Either way, what Francis is doing is because he is so at peace with himself, he's able to bring out the best in other people. So, okay, Francis. Those are the stories, a bunch of the stories that sort of tell you about Francis's brand of mysticism. Now I'll tell you a few stories about Clare's brand of mysticism. Hers was much more contemplative, much more located in the cloister in which she lived. But one of the reasons we have as much from Francis and teachings from Francis as we do is because Clare recorded things. Now, one of the places that we get these is from, we have 4 actual letters that were written in Clare's own handwriting and sent to a woman whose name was Agnes of Prague. Agnes of Prague was she was actually one of the daughters of the King of Prague, or the Prince of Prague. And Agnes wanted to follow Clare's way of life, despite being a woman of great nobility. And so she was working with Clare to know exactly how to do it. And so these letters are written over, I think, a 12-year period near the end of Clare's life. And so Clare writes to Agnes about poverty as an imitation of Christ. And she also talks about the 4 practices that are central to Clare's contemplative life. It's gaze, consider, contemplate, and imitate. What does that mean? Clare spent those 26 years mostly in bed and mostly in the company of the San Damiano cross. I don't know if you remember the picture that Scott had. There was a shiny spot around the halo around the head of the Christ. That was as good as a mirror's got in the 12th century. And so Clare could see her face in that. And so as she gazed on the cross, she was gazing not only at the Christ, but she was seeing herself reflected as the beloved of the Christ. She was seeing the Christ moving into her. And so her contemplative practice had to do with gazing at that cross or gazing at the Christ. And then that's sort of using your senses. And then consider is using your head, thinking about it. And contemplate is using your heart. So she's using her I just see Scott's. The word lupa is an Italian word for she-wolf and also slang for prostitute. Thank you, Mr. Google. So as Clare is engaged in these practices, she's using her senses, her mind, her heart. And then the final practice is to imitate. So as a contemplative practice, it doesn't end with thinking about things or feeling things or contemplating him. It ends with imitating the Christ. And that's what Clare did in life with the sisters in her monastery, that she was able to model just this beautiful servanthood way of life with the sisters. The sisters would go out begging for food, as I said, and sometimes they would have enough, sometimes not enough. But it was often attributed to Clare as a miracle that she would bless the bread and then it would be multiplied. And that's actually one of the miracles that was attributed to her in the process, her sainthood process. Canonization, that's it, canonization. Also another story that I love this story about, there were, I think it was Saracens that were invading Italy. They were moving up through Italy or maybe down through Italy. That's it, down through Italy. And they came to the town of Assisi and they were going to, these are armed infidels. These are armed, ferocious people. They were going to invade the town of Assisi itself and plunder it and do all of the raping and pillaging that that the Saracens are attributed to. And they came to the San Damiano first. And so Claire heard them coming, and her room, the room where she was cloistered, was on the second floor. And during her lifetime, you could open a door and stand out on a balcony. She heard them coming. She called for the monstrance, which is the vessel that holds the sanctified host. And she went and stood out on the balcony, just holding the monstrance, looking at the people that wanted to invade her town. They'd been thinking that, you know, this is a woman's monastery, and so it's going to be easy target, right? But there's this woman on the balcony, and she's just standing and looking at them. She's not threatening. She's not making faces. She's just looking at them. And perhaps they saw reflected in her their own mothers. Perhaps they saw their own sisters reflected in her. Perhaps they saw the holiness of Claire, but they just could not invade. It's, you know, the story, or Jesus says in Luke, if someone strikes you on the cheek, turn the other cheek, so that if they hit you with their hand going that way, they have to hit you like that. This is what Claire was doing. She was saying, I am human. You are human. And part of me wants to say she was also thinking, does your mother know you're doing this? And maybe maybe they had this sense also, but they turned around and they never invaded Assisi. So that's pretty lovely. I love that story. So, I read somewhere in the last couple of weeks that Francis teaches us how to do, and Claire teaches us how to be. So Francis is out on the highways and the byways, in the swamps and wherever else, preaching the gospel. And Claire is in her monastery, contemplating, doing the gaze, consider, contemplate, imitate. Francis, there was a point in his life, in his ministry, where he thought, I don't know, should I be preaching or should I be praying? I mean, look at Claire. She's pretty holy. She's praying all the time. Maybe that's what I should be doing. So Francis would go off into these hermitages, and he would pray. In fact, when Francis wrote the rule for his order that was approved by the Pope finally, the brothers were to spend half of their time preaching and half of their time praying. And so if one of the brothers was praying, the others were taking care to make sure that that person only needed to be praying in terms of like gaze, consider, contemplate, imitate. That person had plenty of space, plenty of room, and didn't need to worry about what they were going to eat. And then the roles would switch, so that the other then would be in the hermitage praying. So Francis is really attracted to the life of just being able to pray. But he knew that he was also supposed to preach. So he said, Claire, pray with me and help me figure out, should I be a preacher, or should I be someone that's just praying all the time? And Claire prayed about it for a while, and she said, the answer is yes. Do both. And so that's why Francis introduced into his rule both praying and preaching. Now, you might remember that Francis is the person who said, preach the gospel at all times, if necessary, use words. You've read that? You've heard that? Yeah. So Francis said that because for him, preaching wasn't necessarily talking. Preaching was caring for lepers, caring for creation. In the 12th century, they weren't really thinking in terms of, like climate change and the kind of things that we do to care for creation. It was treating the wolf as something that needed to be fed as well as humans. It was telling the birds about how beloved they were by their creator. It was poor Francis, he's the guy that takes worms off the road and puts them into the grass or into the forest so they don't get stepped on. Francis did not injure any living thing. So yeah, it was caring for all of creation and caring for all humans, especially the very impoverished humans. And then, if necessary, using words. So Francis then lived his life in that cycle of prayer and preaching, prayer and preaching, prayer and preaching. Because Clare was a woman, she pretty much had to stay cloistered. Clare wanted the privilege of poverty. That is to say that she wanted to not have to own property and not have to receive money from the church. The Pope didn't like that. Clare argued with 9 popes about the privilege of poverty. Of course, Francis got the privilege of poverty, but Clare couldn't get the privilege of poverty. Part of it was that the popes were concerned that the church would end up having to support these women, and they didn't want to have to support these women. He wanted them to earn a decent living or to bring their dowries into the convent and have their families caring for them, because in those times, if a noblewoman went into a convent, she brought all of her servants with her, and she brought all of her dowry, and so she was endowed, as it were. She had a place in the monastery and was taken care of because of the money of her family. Well, that isn't what Clare did. She gave all of her dowry away to the poor and really lived the life of poverty. And it took until she was on her deathbed to get a pope to admit that, oh, all right, you don't have to own property. You can have the rule that you've been living by all of this time. So that was pretty cool. Clare is the person who said to the Pope, and we know she said this because she wrote in a letter. The Pope had said to her, "No, you must accept property. You must own things. You must have a living." And Clare was insisting on poverty, and so she wrote back to him saying, "I will respect you, but I will not obey you," which was just a revolutionary thing for a woman to say to the Pope. She said it, and then she got sainted. Way to go, Clare. So, I told you a whole bunch of stuff. I want to wonder just at this moment how Francis and Clare's legacy continues. How many of you have heard of the Center for Action and Contemplation? You've heard of Richard Rohr, right? Richard Rohr. That is one of the ways that their legacy has continued. Richard Rohr follows what he calls my father, Francis. So yes, the practice of spiritual direction is something that has been in the church since, I think Scott told you, since at least the Desert Fathers and Mothers. But the particular brand of spiritual direction that I follow and that Franciscans follow is based on the mysticism of Francis and Clare, the life of both preaching and contemplation, the life that uses all 4 of those practices of gaze, consider, contemplate, imitate. And then, of course, we know that there are a lot of people that do care for creation, care for the poor, using the same theologies and the same mysticism that Francis and Clare did. For a Franciscan, the reason I speak a lot about care for the poor is for a Franciscan, for Francis in particular, the incarnation was like the most important thing that happened in Christianity. The Feast of the Incarnation, that would be Christmas, is a much more important holiday than Easter, because for Francis, Easter was kind of a foregone conclusion, and that the Creator would become one of the created was the thing that he felt was the salvific act. So incarnation is absolutely central to how he understands everything, everything. Francis just was so devoted to that notion that it is good to be a human, and it is good to have a body. I don't know if you know that much about church history and that much about the historical theological trends, but Augustine would be rolling in his grave over this one. Saint Augustine just loathed the human body, and that goes back to the Greek, the dualism. But I'm going to leave that aside. Because I get cranky. So I have a prayer that Pope Francis wrote that's kind of based on what Franciscan theology is in terms of peacemaking, and what Franciscan mysticism is, because it's based on that mystery of the incarnation. So this is the prayer. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Help us remove venom from our judgments. Help us speak about others as our brothers and sisters. You are faithful and trustworthy. May our words be seeds of goodness for the world. Where there's shouting, let us practice listening. Where there is confusion, let us inspire harmony. Where there's ambiguity, let us bring clarity. Where there is exclusion, let us offer solidarity. Where there is sensationalism, let us offer sobriety. Where there is superficiality, let us offer real questions. Where there is prejudice, let us awaken trust. Where there's hostility, let us bring respect. Where there is falsehood, let us bring truth. Amen. So I see Warren wrote a note. Francis brings out our best by listening and identifying the underlying needs of problem people. The wolf by selflessly considering the others without having a personal agenda of his own. Yes, yes. No personal agenda of his own. And that comes because he is at peace within himself. Yeah. Are there other questions? I have just nattered relentlessly.
I have to say that as a guy of a certain age in this Baptist youth group, had a very impressionable moment when the movie Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon came out. I think I saw it 3 or 4 times, even when you had to go to a theater to see it. Do you does anybody have a sense of how faithful that movie was to the facts of Francis and Clare?
Yeah. Most of the Franciscans that I've talked to about that think that it's a romanticized version. Many of them that I've talked to are celibates, and so they wouldn't like the love story that seems to be brewing between Francis and Clare. But there is an apocryphal tale, and I believe it's apocryphal, but everybody loves it in Assisi. There's the tale of Francis and Clare having a picnic in the woods between their two monasteries. They're having this picnic in the woods, and they are talking about things of God. And it's such a beautiful conversation that it looks like the woods are on fire. And the whole town rushes down with buckets of water to put out the fire. And then they discover, oh, it's Francis and Clare having a talk. So there's that going on.
Just a theological chat.
Yeah, just a little theological
Mm.
chat. Scott and I have that all the time, theological chats.
Mhm.
But the reality is that they were medieval people, and it would have just been incomprehensible for a medieval woman to be alone with a medieval man. It just, unless you were married, and even then, you were living in a house with your whole family. So that just wouldn't have happened. And Francis and Claire, because they were religious people, they were vowed religious, they wouldn't have a romantic relationship. Yeah. Scout?
Yes. Um, as you know, I spent a Holy Week in 1974 in Assisi at San Damiano, retreating. It was quite a wonderful experience. And on the Wednesday of Holy Week, we went in town, some of us, because in the auditorium there, Franco Zeffirelli had brought the film Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon to show to the Franciscans, and showed up himself and apologized that he brought an English version instead of an Italian one. It was all he had. So he stood there in front of us, the nuns on one side of this auditorium, the monks, the Franciscan brothers and priests on the other. For some reason, I sat with the nuns. I don't remember why, but I remember
God.
one of them, when Francis takes his clothes off, one of the nun behind me said, "He looks just like Adam," which is that there's a lot of information there. Uh, but what was interesting was before it all happened, Zeffirelli didn't stay for the viewing. He dropped the thing off, said hello, and then he was out the door. But before they let him out the door, one of the Franciscan priests, who probably had some sort of panache or authority, was saying what an awful movie it was. That was very little like they understood Francis. And Zeffirelli said, yeah. Well, I just made the movie for Catholics in South America, so they'd have some idea of the story. So that answers um, Dan's question, I hope, a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. I thought it was just because I was only talking to nuns myself. That reminds me, Scott, that you were at San Damiano. It reminds me that Saint Clare is the patron saint of television. Not because there was television in the day, but because Saint Clare is reputed to have been capable of bilocation. Do you know what that means? She can be in two places at once.
Hmm.
So, yeah. She could, because she was bedridden, she could witness the mass from her bed, even though the mass was in a different part of the convent.
Whoa,
So, yeah,
that's interesting.
yeah.
Oh,
Doug,
I think Doug has a question.
Yeah,
yeah.
I would share that when my wife and I moved out of Chicago, we moved into a small town in Illinois off the Mississippi, and she got a job at a college, Mount St. Clair, and Mount St. Clair College formed in what, I don't know, 1918, and was going along, and the nuns there made it very clear to her that they were not poor Clares. They had been, they were daughters of rather rich farmers and had gone into the nunnery. And anyway, the school lasted the 2005. It finally closed out of lack
Yeah.
of participation and interest.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well, there actually is, I'm not real sure about how this works, but there are different orders of Franciscans and women that are St. Clare's. I work for the Sisters of St. Francis of Philadelphia. So for the sisters, I worked for the Sisters of St. Francis. I think they're third or no, they're second order Franciscans. Third order Franciscans are the ones who um, are not living in community, who have taken temporary vows, or who are lay people and following the Franciscan vows. I think the Poor Clares, they're a different order than the Sisters of St. Francis, and they really are Poor Clares. I mean, they totally follow what Clare had with the privilege of poverty. Yeah, yeah. And there aren't a lot of them left anymore.
Mm.
There is a St. Clair Catholic Church and School in Southwest Portland, by the way.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it is the St. Clair that we think of in Assisi. Yeah.
Well, we're over 8 o'clock. I want to thank Eileen very much for
It was very
giving
good.
us this
Thank
window.
you.
Yeah. Let me say that next week we have Mark Lesniewski, who's a colleague of Eileen's, who also works as a spiritual director at the Franciscan Center, speaking to us about the dark night of the soul, the Spanish mystic who was friends with Teresa of Avila. John of the Cross is the author. So Mark's going to take us through that. I have a feeling it'll be some information and also a bit of a meditation as well, because of the nature of that work. And I think it brings a whole nother window on medieval mysticism that we would miss if we didn't have someone who embodied it the way Mark does. He's a darling man, and I look forward to having him with us next Sunday.
Cool.
So blessings on all, and
Yeah.
this has been fun. Thanks again.
Hey,
Thanks
Scott.
for all of you.
Yeah.
Thanks for
Scott,
letting me
before
do this.
Oh, okay. Hey, Kathy, can you let me share something? I have I wanted to share a picture from this morning that my wife took from where she was sitting.
Okay.
It was when Scott was talking to the children about about his stoles. From where my wife was sitting, his face was right in the middle of this wood piece with all this other art showing, and I thought this was a really cool picture. So
That's
great.
lovely. Yeah.
Close to a halo as I'll ever get.
Yeah, there you go. So anyway, that was
Perfect.
end of share.
That's great. I'm so glad she was there.
Yeah, it was something of a miracle. Yeah.
I thought the service was quite beautiful today. I was seeing the video version of it, but it was, I think we did a good job with the video, and it did look really striking. And the crosses that you showed in your stoles, those were great. It was beautiful. Art Show Sunday is always wonderful.
Yeah,
Better than Easter, I think that's what he said.
Hey, Eileen, could I ask a bonus question?
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
is probably off the subject, but I was curious. I have a sister-in-law who is an Orthodox Christian, and she and her husband have a business of making, what do you call them? Icons.
Icons?
She makes icons. And I was just wondering about these particular saints, Francis and Clare. Do they have a following in the Orthodox Church as well, or do you know anything about that?
Not so much. I've never heard of the Orthodox followers of that. What I know is that the Orthodox saints are a different category of the Roman Catholic, because those two churches split in the 10th century.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, they might still adhere to some of the desert mothers and fathers, but probably not The,
Interesting. So they have their
Eastern-
own
yeah,
saints, but the icons
yeah,
they make are
yeah.
beautiful. I mean, they're really lovely.
Yeah.
And I know that they have a very contemplative
Mhm.
practice.
Yeah.
But anyway,
Yeah,
all right.
that's actually a really beautiful sort of way of praying, is writing an icon. But
Mhm.
I know there are icons of Francis and Clare.
Right. I know I've seen that.
probably-
In fact, I think she may
yeah.
have given me one at some point.
Ah.
She gives us appropriate icons for various situations. That's her.
That's really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, they're
I'd
beautiful.
Yeah.
love to see those.
The one for, dental pain or whatever it is.
Well, the Franciscan Center has two icons of Francis and Clare. They're just lovely, but they're not they're in the correct geometry, but they're not classic icons.
Well, thank you. I thought it was wonderful. And I will have this up onto the Facebook group and the YouTube channel so you can share it with your friends.
That's
All right.
great. Hey, good night.
Lovely.
Thank you all.
Lovely.
Right.
Thanks,
Thank
Eileen.
you,
Thanks.
everyone.
You're
Thanks
welcome.
again.
You're welcome.